Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they had it so correct. It is absolutely unbelievable. And Samuel Adams was so predictive in what he was dealing with at the foundation of this nation. That's why he's called the father of the American Revolution, because he was able to bring all of the thoughts and the fundamental biblical, because remember, he was called the last Puritan, biblical ideas of government to reality. And, I guess if you want to, you can call him the theonomist that understood those biblical truths of that time. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. And today's program, what I'm calling this is Defense of Self and State. All of this insanity coming from the administration, and all their socialists and communists are at the head. All the Davos crowd, all of those who are atheists, who are just caught up in the government God, or should I say the God of government. But what we're going to talk about today is the Second Amendment, all that's going on. Go to samueladamsreturns.net for the full outline and the blog post of the promo, as well as all of those that are on the other radio markets. You can get the second segment there at samueladamsreturns.net in the full audio, as well as the video will be available shortly thereafter. So in today's program, first segment, this segment is we're going to cover the historical basis of defense of self and state. We're going to talk about the constitutional historical references of the Second Amendment. We're going to talk first off about Sam Adams in none other than 1769 and what he had to say very clearly on the rights, God-given rights of self-defense, but more so to defend against tyranny. To defend against tyranny. So we're going to go through that. We may get to a couple state constitutions and court cases. Then in the second segment, that's why all of you that want to hear this, go to samueladamsreturns.net, and you're going to get all about gun control is not morality. No morality is being taught in schools anymore, not even from the pulpits in many, even evangelical churches. So civil society is under humanism and what? The God called government. So that we'll deal with. We're going to jump into a little bit, if we have time, some more. The national religion of humanism, with that emphasis to that which I talked about last week on the moralistic, therapeutic deism. There's just a lot there, but just touch on that. But I think more so, we need to go back to the Belcher Foundation, and what Governor Belcher was talking about is the supremacy of God's moral law in government and for we the people, self-governing and thereon. Then the third segment, it's about speaking the whole truth. No sidestepping the defense of individual state. So the individual, the state, and the republic. So I think that there's only one person, which I'll mention in this segment, that is actually taking that on appropriately. And we will cover that here shortly. But in that, in talking about the whole truth, we're going to touch globalism. We're going to touch Davos, not directly, but through what President Eisenhower identified as the military-industrial complex and why they do not want a well-regulated militia, why they do not want we, the people, to have the capacity to stand up against tyranny. Wow, that is so much to cover. And as always, I'll get through everything that I possibly can, trying to stay succinct within that. But, first and foremost is the historical fact. I said in a Facebook post earlier this week is that the truth of the Second Amendment is not being spoken of, nor has it been litigated through the Supreme Court. Everybody talks about self-defense, self-defense, self-defense. True, that's there. And we'll cover that all the way back into the English Constitution. But the fact of the matter is that self-defense is inclusive of defending not just one's person, but property and form of government and our full beliefs under God. And that is the whole foundational system upon which this nation was built. Now, I'll tell you, recently, the only person that I have read, and there's probably others that I haven't read, but the only person that I've read recently is Molly Hemingway in what she did on a Fox News program this past week. She was on, what's that guy's name? Jesse Waters. And Jesse Waters, she talked about Biden's speech on gun legislation. So I guess that was on Thursday night. And that the fact is, and she's nailing it, not just for this reason, I say, is that he is impeachable. He is impeachable because he's violating his oath. He's attacking, not defending the Constitution. He's attacking it. And I'll even bring up something later on about Van Jones, who, if you remember Van Jones being the Obama Green Czar, he is a blatant communist. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But where I'm taking you is into my favorite resource of the Founders Constitution. And it's there. The link to the Founders Constitution is there. As you well know, it's multiple volumes, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it goes into detail the historical significance and arguments, both Federalists, Anti-Federalists, and others, into the whole construct of the Constitution. So with that, where I want to jump to, and I'm sorry we're going to miss it here on timeline, is that Sam Adams, in Sam Adams' wisdom, you must go there and read that in detail, because Sam Adams in 1776 wrote an article, 1769, wrote an article and signed it as EA. And what he's talking about is that the revolution at that time was at the British Revolution, Constitution was again restored to its original principles. You have to understand that. And that afterwards it was passed into law, and then it stands as the bulwark of natural rights of the subjects. So he goes on to say this, and we're going to read it because it's important to understand the foundations. To vindicate these rights, says Mr. Blackstone, when actually violated or attacked, the subjects of England are entitled first to a regular administration and free course of justice in the courts of law. Next, to the right of petitioning the King and Parliament for redress of grievances. And lastly, to the right of having and using arms for self-preservation and defense. Very critical how that is outlined. Then he goes on to say, Blackstone calls these auxiliary subordinate rights, which serve principally as barriers to protect and maintain inviolate the three great and primary rights of personal security, personal liberty, and private property. And that of having arms for their defense tells us is a public allowance under due restrictions of the natural right of resistance and self-preservation. When the sanctions of society and laws are found insufficient to restrain the violence of oppression, how little do those persons attend to the rights of the Constitution. If they know anything about them, who find fault with the late vote of this town, being Boston, calling upon inhabitants to provide themselves with arms for their defense at any time, but more especially when they had reason to fear there would be a necessity of the means of self-preservation against the violence of oppression. Everyone knows that the exercise of military power is forever dangerous to civil rights. And we have had in recent stances of violence that have been offered to private subjects, and the last week, even to a magistrate in the execution of his office. Such violence are no more than might have been expected from military troops. A power which is apt enough at all times to take wanton lead, even when in the midst of civil society, but more especially so when they are led to believe that they are become necessary to awe a spirit of rebellion, and preserve peace and good order. But there are some persons who would, if possibly they could, persuade the people never to make use of their constitutional rights or terrify them from doing it. Get that? That's exactly what this administration and all the leftist, communist, socialists, godless in Congress, in your state, in education are doing right now. Persuade the people never to make use of their constitutional rights, or here it is, or to terrify them from doing it. No wonder that a resolution of this town to keep arms for its own defense should be represented as having a bottom, a secret intention to oppose the landing of the king's troops, when those very persons who gave it this coloring had before represented the people's petitioning their sovereign as proceeding from a factious and rebellious spirit, and would now insinuate that there is an impropriety in their addressing even a plantation governor upon public business. Such are the times we are fallen into. Ladies and gentlemen, in this last minute, what was going on here with Sam Adams is he's saying exactly what we have going on right now from the media, from the administration, in local government, in relationship to schools, from the judiciary, from every effort is to persuade you away from taking and standing on your constitutional rights and terrifying you that everyone that will stand on their rights are factious and rebellious spirit, that you're insurrectionist, you're rebellion. No, my friends, what it is you're standing on truth and your rights constitutionally to do so. Come on back in a few moments as we get into the second segment, and definitely go to the resources at SamuelAdamsReturns.net, where all is explained from that historical perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists got it right. This is Tom Navulis, your host. I don't recall that I introduced myself in the last segment, but what I want to finish with and remind you of in this segment is to go to the references there at samueladamsreturns.net, where I have listed in the references from the Founders Constitution about the Second Amendment, and it has in there very clearly all of the documents that are listed that give credence to the Second Amendment. The first one that I wanted to take you to, though, here is, and I'll bring it up again in the third segment, is that William Blackstone, in his commentaries, when he talks about the auxiliary rights of a subject, is that having arms for their defense suitable to their condition and degree, and in England was allowed by law under William and Mary. But what was secured was indeed the public allowance under due restrictions of natural rights of resistance and self-preservation. You have to understand, you always have that right to resist the government. In the Pennsylvania Constitution, it was very clearly designed is that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. And here's something that the founders were very clear on, that not many people understand. As standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept. And that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power, which, with the military-industrial complex, we have a standing army, and we should never have had it. And then when they were arguing in the House of Representatives the amendment to the Constitution, the first aspects of this argument that was there in that proposed amendment, and it was really interesting, is the well-regulated militia. Here's the original language: composed of a body of people, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no person religiously scrupulous shall be compelled to bear arms. Now, that was argued pretty heavily in taking, and that was removed because they didn't want to have the government defining who was religiously scrupulous, because they could say, oh, all you Reformed Christians, all you Catholics, or all you whatever Protestant, you're religiously scrupulous, so you're not compelled to bear any arms, so therefore you can't have them. That's what the argument was. That's the gist of the argument during that period of time, and that's why that was removed from the Second Amendment, so that no one religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person upon paying an equivalent. Oh, it went on in all these arguments. But the most important concept that was in this argument in Congress itself was that they shouldn't have a standing army. A navy, yes. A standing army, no. And then St. George Tucker on Blackstone's commentaries, and this was talking about the English Constitution and then what that meant for us with our Constitution in 1803, wrote this: this may be considered the true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest possible limits. Wherever standing armies are kept and the right of the people to keep bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited, liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. I'm going to stop there because what we have to deal with is that the fact that this administration and all the minions in this administration are communist dupes, progressive liars, socialists, and globalists that hate the Constitution and the foundations of which it is. Now, you have to clearly understand that, as it has been said, and I can't remember who made the quote, but that if we as people are not governed by God, then government is God. I think that was Francis Schaeffer, now that I'm thinking about it. Francis Schaeffer is that if we're not governed, and if government is not governed by God, we aren't individually governed by God, then government becomes God. And that's what's happening. That's what's going on. That's what you have in all these other socialists and communists. Now, I wanted to jump back on the whole idea of morality and civil society, which we don't have, and that it, quite frankly, is that you're not going to get, and this is where everybody's looking, is that gun control is going to take and solve all the problems. Gun control is going to save this. Gun control is going to stop this. Gun control is going to stop all these different shootings, not even in these schools, but in malls and everywhere, blah, 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 blah. No, it's not. Because gun control is not morality. It's the individual that picks up the firearm that then has to take their finger and purposefully put it into the trigger area around where the trigger guard is and physically pull the trigger. In fact, I do want to talk about this from the morality. I want you to go into the references and look at reference number 6 by James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries, where he has done a audio posting, "You are being lied to regularly." And he deals very well with the construct of a firearm and doesn't get into either side of it, but the morality behind the individual that picks up a tool, no different than a hammer, no different than a screwdriver, no different than a knife, no different than a sword, no different than a pickaxe, no different than a pitchfork, no different than a spike. Oh, wait a minute. Those were weapons of war. The axe, the sword, the pick, the long stick with a sharp edge. Oh, on and on it went. Weapons of war, the arms, and that's what it meant to be armed. Sam Adams, in another instance, talks about not only having firearms, arms, but also cannon. To have your cannons. Now, nobody's going to have a cannon at home, only because you could never afford to have one. But the fact was, and the reality is, to stand up against tyranny. But you have to have the moral basis to be able to do that. And that what we have going on, and I'll just mention briefly again, is that moralistic, therapeutic, what? Deism. That's where most people are at. Remember? Remember what we talked about last week? That this is a world view that the majority, even of Christians, have. The majority of Christians have. This is a worldview of a mixed match of ideologies that sit there and you go, wait a minute, what? I think, maybe some of you do too, what's going on? What's going on is that moral determination from a biblical 10 Commandments, simple 10 Commandment point of view is not in the worldview of a lot of young people. And I will say that what we have with all of the violence in gaming, there's no moral determination to help the young people understand that you just can't shoot things up. It doesn't work that way. That is just pure and utter violence. Remember here is that the people that believe in this idea of this moralistic deism, this moralistic, I call it, well, it is. It's called moralistic therapeutic deism. That's all part of the mental health blabber. They believe that God is out in the distance. That's deism. People are supposed to be good to each other. Well, what does that mean? How do you know what is good, what is bad, if you don't have a fundamental foundational essence for that? The universal purpose of life is being happy and feeling good about oneself. No, I debunked that last week as well. There are no absolute moral truths. Right there, boom. So that means that government as God can dictate what is morality, and with no moral absolute truths, like, here's one for you. Don't steal. Well, how about another? Don't kill. How about this one? Don't look upon what your neighbor has and want it. It's just the desire of, I want what he has. Is that the keeping up with the Joneses? And here's the one, fundamentally, God allows good people to go to heaven. And then God places very limited demands on people. Just think those through. And think through then how government is coming in and saying, if you do not have this, if you do not do this, if you do this, if you do that, wait a minute, who is placing demands on the people? And where is that in the construct of our foundational liberties? The supremacy of God's law is something that I love definitely, the Belcher Foundation and what is with that. And there is an article there. I have the link in there. This is the supremacy of God's moral law for government. God's moral law is the principle. The Ten Commandments is reaffirmed by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. People say Jesus is all about love, all about love. We have to love our neighbor. Yes, he says that love is the greatest. But you know something? They're reaffirmed. The Ten Commandments are, if you really study all that Scripture has to say in relationship to the Sermon on the Mount, it's a reaffirmation. There is a moral law. God's moral law is biblical, and that was foundationally there. Governor Belcher supported Jonathan Edwards' Christian worldview, and it's substantiated in a number of letters. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to understand that. That's foundational. Well, as we get into this section and wrap it up real quick here, because we need to be moving on into the third segment in just a minute or so. Really, where is the Christian outcry to take and stand on these foundational truths? And we're going to go back into it as we get into the third segment. But if there is no foundational, substantial, specific morality that determines how we act in society, there's no such thing as a civil society. There is that of despotism and tyranny, and that's what the founders stood up against. They stood up against it, and they took and they ensured that we would have it enshrined for our understanding and to live by in the Second Amendment as a mechanism to truly what? Not just for self-defense, but to defend the Constitution of our state and the state in general, being the republic that was formed within the Constitution of the United States. Sam Adams clearly understood this as well as the Anti-Federalists. Come on back in the next segment and we'll continue on with more. See you in a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third and final segment of Samuel Adams Returns. The Anti-Federalist absolutely got it correct. This is Tom Navolis, your host. I don't know that I introduced myself in the first segment, but we're going to get right to it. And what I'm going to talk about is picking up just a little bit from the Founders Constitution. I highly suggest those on the other Christian radio networks to go to SamuelAdamsReturns.net. Listen to the second segment that's there. Read the different articles, the different references that I have for you there, because the bottom line is, without morality, there is no civil society. And the fact is that gun control is not morality. Gun control is not morality. So just quickly, in this segment, I said we want to talk about the whole truth, which I'm going to, and that we're going to talk about the idea of the defense of the individual, the state, and the republic in general, and that the military-industrial complex does not want you to have firearms for all the globalist reasons that they are a part of. And definitely the Van Jones, the Obamas, all of the socialist, communist, atheist, humanist do not want you to have that, because, as I'm going to tell you right now, is that is a mechanism of defending liberty. As I noted in the second segment real quickly, I took you through the folks there through what is listed in the Founders Constitution in relationship to the justification for the full intent of the Second Amendment. And I did mention before is that I think that Molly Hemingway did a grand job of not only saying, and I say for a lot of reasons, that Biden is impeachable because he is he's violating his oath. He's breaking every fundamental concept of our Constitution, our republic, and quite honestly, nobody's got the intestinal fortitude, and I'll be really crass here, including the Republicans, don't have the balls to go after it. Not at the state level. So guess what? You, as an individual, have to understand what is here for the Second Amendment. And the argument of it is even codified in the Pennsylvania Constitution, original Constitution of 1776, Declaration of Rights, Article 13 says the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. Now hear this very clearly, because you missed it in the second segment. Here it is. As a standing army in a time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept. We'll talk about that with the military-industrial complex. And the military should be kept under the strict subordination to and by the civil authority. Now, one of the areas that I wanted to go through in St. George Tucker's commentaries on Blackstone and what he wrote in 1803, I mentioned it before. This is considered regarding the Second Amendment as a true palladium of liberty. The right of self-defense is the first law of nature. In most governments, it has been the study of rulers to confine this right within the narrowest limits possible. Whenever standing armies are kept up and the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, under any color or pretext whatsoever, Biden administration, the present violators of constitutionalism, Tucker continues to say, color or pretext whatsoever, prohibited liberty, if not already annihilated, is on the brink of destruction. In England, the people have been disarmed, generally under the specious pretext of preserving the game, a never-failing lure to bring over the landed aristocracy to support any measure under that mask, though calculated for very different purposes. True, it is. Their Bill of Rights seems at first view to counteract this policy, but the right of bearing arms is confined to the Protestants and the words suitable to their constitution and degree have been interpreted to authorities the prohibition of keeping guns or other engines for the destruction of game only to any farmer or inferior tradesman or other persons not qualified to kill game, so that not one man in 500 can keep a gun in his house without being subject to a penalty. So then William Rawle, in a view of the Constitution of the United States in 1829, he talks about the second article of a well-regulated militia to the security of a free state, the prohibition from which few will dissent. And that's what it's important to a free state. Although this is in actual war, the service of irregular troops are confessed more valuably, yet while peace prevails, and in the commencement of a war, a regular force can be raised, a militia form of palladium of a country. They are ready to repel invasion, to suppress insurrection, to preserve the good order and peace of the government. We're supposed to have a civilian militia because we know what we need in our state. This whole idea of a standing army is wrong and fundamentally unconstitutional. So then when it gets down to the right of personal carrying of firearms, it goes back and he also reiterates that which St. George Tucker explained about Blackstone. Joseph Story's commentary in 1890 through 91, 1833, he writes, is the importance of this article, being the Second Amendment, will scarcely be doubted by any person who have duly reflected upon the subject. The militia is the natural defense of a free country against sudden foreign invasion. That means like all of the illegals crossing the border. Domestic insurrection. That means what Black Lives Matter, not what happened on January 6th, but Black Lives Matter and all the other communists. And domestic usurpation of power by rulers. Joseph Story, a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that's what he said. It is against sound policy for a free people to keep a large army, military establishment, and standing armies in time of peace, both from the enormous expense with which they are attended and the faculty means which they afford to ambitious and unprincipled rulers to subvert the government or, here it is, trample upon the rights of the people. The right of the citizen to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers. That goes back to the second segment. And will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, that means these rulers, usurpation, arbitrary power, this enables the people to resist and triumph over them. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, as you're listening to this, you must go back. You read the whole thing that is there, and I'm telling you, You have to understand it's not just about personal self-defense. No. Joseph Story, a Supreme Court justice, says it is to defend ourselves against Biden, against what is happening with the left, Nancy Pelosi, and all of the other leftists. They're using the Constitution against us, who are a free people. Wow. Wow, that gets me pretty excited, obviously, and that we are to stand up for that liberty. Now, just real quick on the military-industrial complex, something just in there to get you to think about in considering what was going on, and how did that work? Where did that come from? I have to tell you, I was really impressed when I was taking and looking at the study on this, and coming to find out that it was about torpedoes. Huh? What do you mean, torpedoes? Well, yeah, it was about torpedoes. So you go all the way back, is that we became this industrial nation. So we were taking in, all of a sudden, when we saw what was going on and the whole tie of government and industry coming together, that should have never happened. And it should never happen. And that's where we talk about in other programs all of the evils that have happened since the internal entanglements of the industrialist with government. That's fascism. No other terminology. That's the root of fascism. So we've been living in fascism since since the Civil War, if you will. If you really look at, I think that here I'm going to really get everybody upset. Abraham Lincoln was the one that introduced fascism into America before fascism became a term, and the fact that he linked industry and government so tightly together. Wow, Tom, what are you saying? Well, let's go back here. All right, are you really ready for this? Last couple of minutes, we'll have some fun with it. This article that I have for you is from Early Origins of Military-Industrial Complex, and it's in your references. Go check it out. So what we have here is torpedoes. They were invented in 1866. Remember that in the Civil War, the ironclads, all of that. Robert Whitehead did this. And the whole idea was these things were expensive. They were expensive, and they were very useful for war. Look at all that you could do with a torpedo versus a ship carrying guns. Did you know that at that time, and actually by 1910, a torpedo could go 6 miles at the speed of 50 miles an hour? 1910. So that was faster than a Model A Ford. So procuring them, very difficult. So here we go. Boom. This connection, R&D, research and development, became the government contractors coming together to collaborate and do what? Come up with the best ways to produce torpedoes and other weaponry. You have all the way back that in government relations, the anti-espionage legislation went in 1889. The Official Secrets Act in Britain, and in 1911, the National Defense Secret Act in the United States, to classify scientific and technological information as secret for the reasons of national security. Yeah. But then as we got on, we got all the spies. You got the Chinese spies. You have everybody else. Well, there's a lot more to it. Go to the references there. Listen to the speech again of Dwight Eisenhower. And ladies and gentlemen, please understand you have the absolute right to bear arms, not just for your personal protection, but to stand up against usurpation and tyranny and the despotism that we are seeing in these United States now. Guess what? Sam Adams understood that. The Anti-Federalists understood that. That's why we have the Second Amendment. So come on back next week when Samuel Adams returns and those Anti-Federalists absolutely got it right.